So what we're going to do is look at word bubbles of the things that were discussed. So up on the slide deck right now, you can see the word bubble that came out of the discussion from the track 1 group over here. I know it's kind of hard to see. Yeah. So the big thing that came out was information, sharing, agencies. So I'm going to go for the groups, for the people that were in session 1. What are some of the key things that were discussed, or a common theme that you guys had?
A big theme at our table was who actually has.
I think it just took
a big theme at our table was who actually has control of our data, and how do we track control of the data? When we give it to somebody, how do we know how it will be used, not only by them, but then by other agencies, organizations that they share the data with? And where is the onus in making sure that the providers of the information know where their information has gone?
All right, that's good. Other discussion topics at the tables? I know there was some lively discussion. I was at those tables, so don't be shy.
I wasn't there, Leo, but one of the things that sticks out in this word bubble to me is purchase. I thought that that was really interesting in a policy. There's sharings and always, but purchase came up sufficiently given its size. So I would love to hear in what context.
How did purchase come up in?
At least for us, one of the points that we came up with was something that was in a Forbes article not too long ago about if you are receiving a service that is free or at a reduced cost, you're actually the product that's being sold, because they're collecting the information from you and they're using it to sell to other people. They're purchasing it from the collecting organization and then using it either on Amazon for variable pricing or to provide what are quote-unquote deals for other services like hotel rooms. They're collecting this information from you and then they're selling it. Google's, of course, a big company that does this when they go through your email, which is also one of the questions we had was, at what point do we start thinking about going through email as being just like going through your regular mail? And what kinds of regulations should there be on those types of communiques?
And also, just really quick, I also heard basically in terms of when I was walking around tables, just purchase in terms of the government purchasing private databases. So there are private databases out there to be purchased. And then I think one of the things that was discussed at one of the tables was what happens when the government purchases one of the private databases. Does anyone want to talk about that after?
Well, I wasn't ready to grab that one, but we did have a conversation relative that there was an expectation that in the private sector, they were going to sell you data, much like, if you're not paying for a product, you are the product. But there seemed to be a more higher level of care expected of the government relative to sharing the data with other agencies. For instance, if education had data for one purpose, that data wouldn't be shared with, say, I don't know, the IRS or something along that line.
One of the things we discussed at our table was the difference between identity and privacy, and then use cases. For example, what's going on with the NSA, who is that targeted at as far as protecting the citizens from the bad guy per se, and then with regard to the retail space, protecting innocent consumers from the bad guy. So those were discussions we had.
Okay, so I have one comment, Leo. So looking up, there's one word that's I can't find anywhere up there that I heard talked about at two different tables, which is education. Did anybody have any thoughts or comments on education that they'd like to share with the rest of the room? Anyone? Yes, Paul.
One of the things we talked about was, in government, we go through this annual refresher program. So one of the things is, say in the government or for corporation, we go through an annual security refresher. And what if, say, Google was required or so was required to give an annual security refresher to their consumers, right? So say maybe a half an hour, 15 minutes before they can, or before you can sign up for the service, or at the, they have to say, hey, you need to complete this training for you to continue using this service, right? Especially if it's a free service or so. So where we saw that a lot of this privacy concerns was the consumer may not be very informed on what privacy is or what is entailed once the information is collected and how that information is used throughout the life cycle. So these private companies would probably be in a better position to offer this type of education to consumers versus, say, a government entity trying to stand up and educate consumers. And what if we made that, what if that was a model that was in place?
Yeah, I remember hearing from one of the tables, we were talking about privacy policies and how it's a default, right? So if you're going to sign up for a certain service, by default, you're going to, accept the privacy policy. So, you get a bunch of legalese that no one really reads and you just click accept or agree. So what are some ways that we can kind of change that in terms of making it something that's understandable, something that people actually read or try to understand as well?
One of the concerns we raised was specific to mobile apps. A lot of times you'll download a mobile app, even if you make the effort to read the EULA and you agree and you don't feel it violates your privacy too much or it's acceptable to you. And what happens is you start to use the mobile app. It becomes integrated into your conducting your life and doing business. But then as new version releases come out, the EULA changes. Now it needs to access your contacts. It needs to access other things on your system. So your option at that point is to accept it, and then basically there's been escalation of access to your personal data at that point. Or you could simply uninstall the device, but then you have to unlearn the behavior, and if you're using it for work, you've got to deconflict all that. So that I think that's a concern as well.
And to that point, we discussed at our table the responsibility of the organization group collecting the data of notification to the consumer on policy changes.
I think this kind of raises a good point in terms of public and private. I know from some of the tables that I was at, there was some discussion differences between public and private. So
this is working. But I think there's a word that you mentioned, versus, that's under the O over there, and that really refers to, there are a lot of trade-offs when it comes to securing your identity and data sharing. So it's something to think about for sure.
So getting back, that was a good point. Is there any difference between private and public? I know there was a lot of discussion at the tables over here. So should there be a difference in privacy between a public entity and a private corporation?
So one of the things we talked about was really establishing the definition of public and private, right? Because I think historically, when we think private, we think in our homes. But now with mobile technology and even in your car, going through a toll booth, taking pictures of your license plate, what you're doing in your car, that kind of muddles the conversation, and so there's a bit of a gray area. So I think what we talked about at the table was having the public entities help to identify what those concerns are. So one of the examples we talked about was critical infrastructure. The public sector, DHS, right? They're responsible for identifying pieces of our communications and our IT critical infrastructure. But then how does that apply to citizens that may work at a power plant or a communications bunker? If BYOD is in place, how are their cell phones being tracked and being monitored? So, that balance, public versus private, was definitely a conversation that took place.
So I think another part of that discussion, sort of a tangent, was the management of that privacy data. So comment was made that there are a lot of challenges as it pertains to managing the data that we have in the cleared space right now. So when we start dealing with privacy information, that the U.S. government's responsible for, there comes with it a management overhead that's involved as well. Did any of you all discuss some of the ramifications of data management and how to deal with some of those challenges?
Yeah, so one of the things that just kept coming up in our group was with the data management, how long do you retain the data? And I think that it's sort of, the discussion went around in the past. People sort of thought that, their paper records would be kept for a little while and then they would be discarded. But have we now moved into an era where with digital management, essentially, there's no reason to get rid of records. You can just keep them indefinitely. So it's like a decision that needs to be made. How long do you keep these records, or is there even a reason to get rid of the records?
At our table, we also talked about domains, whether they be public or private, but we also talked about the mosaic effect and whether or not in the management overhead that you define what needs to be protected, what can be inferred, how it can be, even if it's redacted, it can be respun up to identify individuals, so that the overall mosaic came up quite a bit, and that lends itself to the management, understanding what you're hoping to accomplish, what you need to protect individually.
I think an issue also came up for one of the tables in terms of management was trust, right? So, for example, if there's a company that's supposed to have data and they're supposed to have wiped their data, do you really trust that company will either disposed of it properly or that they really disposed of it at all when they were supposed to? So how do we get around these issues of trust?
I think for us, it comes down to a perception in the sense where there may be more implied trust or more implied that the government should do a better job at protecting that information. So if I give something to the government, I feel that they should do more to protect that information and use it for the only purpose what they collect it for. Versus if I give it to Google, I am probably under the perception that Google is going to use it for beyond what I'm giving it for, and therefore the type of information I offer might be different. So I might give Google more of my alternate identity, where I'm going to give the government more of my real identity. So because I trust the government more. Depends, right? Some people might feel the opposite, but so be it.
So one of the things that we talked about actually at a couple of different tables from a technical level, where content or data has a certain amount of sensitivity to it, but it needs to be placed in context. So we could have classified material or even unclassified material, but who should have access to it and what rights do they have access to that content? So without an identity, authentication, and authorization system, it becomes very difficult in order to implement privacy effectively. And then, of course, you need to think about where that data goes. As I share it with third parties, does that policy follow the content as it leaves my enterprise and go into somebody else's hands? So we start getting into a DRM conversation or an ERM conversation. Digital rights management, enterprise rights management, certain things that have notoriously failed us in industry. But as we look forward, we do see a bit of sprouts, if you will, of some new technologies that might be able to resolve this in the future.
So I was just informed that this side of the room, this is our data bubble right here. So looking up at this compared to the one that we were looking at before, is there anything there that sort of jumps out at you all? There's obviously some similarities. I know the data was pretty big on both sides. make sense, as well as info or information. I think my biggest observation is the fact that there are so many, different things going on within this word bubble that, there's a couple areas that you can sort of focus on. But obviously we're dealing with an issue that's got a lot of different variables, right? A lot of different flavors, a lot of different variables, a lot of different opinions as to what it means to each individual. One thing that I also heard some really interesting information, interesting discussion about was data that's kind of pulled together in an aggregate form, or data that can be pulled from different sources in order to reveal more about an individual's identity than it would by itself, right? So that's always one of the big challenges that we deal with. One of my favorite stories that relates to this was when AOL released a bunch of search data. I guess this goes back 3 or 4 years ago, and how easy it was to identify individuals and what individuals were searching on just based on what their anonymous searches were. So were there any thoughts, any discussions on that as being an issue that maybe doesn't have a solution, but how do we kind of get our hands around that? And in an era of open data and open data initiatives, how do we make sure that the data that we're making open can't be used with something else in order to either reveal a vulnerability or reveal somebody's personal identification information? Any thoughts on that? All right, I was the only one that had that thought then. Hey, Bob.
That's actually one that kind of bridged the two groups. And we had a small discussion over here relative to a genealogy type thing. When you start thinking about the challenge questions that a lot of websites will ask you now, such as mother's maiden name, the city of your birth, and things like that, how easy it is to go on to, say, Ancestry.com and get that kind of information. So it came down to a quick discussion relative to how long is information stored for, and information that is being stored that is very old was very often collected for one reason, and it's now being used for yet another reason. And by being able to get to those challenge questions, you could get in and get somebody's privacy data and things along that line. So it kind of interrelated there. And the other word that came up in both places was the word accountable, as to who is accountable for the breaches, who is accountable for the safekeeping. And Marie is very passionate about that.
I actually, on the accountable word, one of the words that came up at our table but isn't listed here that I can see yet is validity, the validity of the data. Justin brought it up in the discussions. If there are no damages from a commercial entity for releasing your data, who's responsible for the validity? And if it's a public sector system, are they responsible for the validity of that data, and what are the recourses? So in ours, not only did we talk about accountability, we talked about recourses for correcting information. We talked about the validity of the information, and to the extent that someone researches my genealogical tree, I'll tell you that I lie about my parents' names, okay? I lie about their birth dates. I have all kinds of other information that I put in, like what's your first pet's name? It's some other address, right? Or it's a number. And the reason to do that is to kind of see how the system is collecting and where it's storing that data. So again, back to the mosaic and the discussion on whether technology can help or hurt the system. But it was very interesting in looking at those things.
Yeah, another word, I guess we're competing here, that I don't see up there that we talked about in every group, and that is trust. It was a matter of the information and privacy, and who do we trust that information with? So, I mean, I think in the discussion, most of us talked about trusting the government, and there was a level of trust there, and in business, trust. And I'm surprised I don't see that word up here. That's just a comment.
So, and as a citizen of the United States, I think a big question also is, do you have a choice, right? I don't from what I've been told, that in the European Union you have a lot more choice about what your data is used for. And how they govern that, I'm not sure. But I know that in this country, regardless of whether or not I trust an agency or a credit bureau with my information, they've got to have it, or else I can't operate. So yeah, trust is absolutely a concern. But what is your choice?
And speaking about trust, I think one of the discussion points that we had was basically unintended consequences, right? So the thing is, sometimes one data set has information, and then the second data set has information like separate from each other. They don't really correlate, and they may not reveal any, personal identifiable information. But if you're putting the two data sets together, then it might become valuable, right? In terms of when you aggregate the data together, and then what are some of the unintended consequences of that, and how's that work in terms of trust? Because you trusted entity 1 to protect data set 1, you trusted entity 2 to protect data set 2, but then this merging or melding of these two data sets then has different consequences.
So I thought I would talk a little bit. So for those who are on this side of the room, so my name is Justin Semany. I'm the Chief Trust Officer at Box. So I think if I don't say something, I should probably be shot. Trust is an interesting term, and Patrick Heim over at Salesforce also has the title. And as far as I know, we're the only two. And of course, Bay Area being what it is, being a microcosm. Trust as a term, I think we need to put that in context, right? So if Chris comes over and hits me 5 times, the next time he comes over, I trust he'll hit me a 6. So the question is, are we implementing trust in concert to our belief system, to a established set of principles, effectively, that will guide us? So at Box, it's fairly easy. All of the data and all the content that we have as our customers, it's not on the consumer side, so therefore we can act very clearly in that confines of trust. But on the consumer side, it's fairly difficult because we have monetization, and that's how Google makes a lot of money. Yahoo makes a lot of money. They need to monetize email and search and all these other things, and that's how they effectively built their businesses. So when we get down to the core of trust, it really needs to be put in context of to what principles and what guiding facts drive that company or that organization. So then we can have repeatability, then we can have consistency, and if that deviates, then we have distrust. So if our sales teams act in a unethical behavior, which is opposite of what we believe and what we feel that is beneficial to the company, or if our availability goes wrong versus the SLA that we stated, that trust is broken. So it needs to be put in context to that.
And so that trust, right, is defined by the ethics of the organization.
Yeah, I would probably say it's a belief system, right, in regards to what is our vision, our mission statement.
Right.
So if we turn around, we make a self-driving car, then a lot of questions should be made in regards to, what is the model of Box. But yes, I think there's contractual stipulations, there's a vision and strategy level, and then there's more of the culture and ethical kind of direction, which is led, which a subsection is security. That goes underneath all of 3 of those areas.
Sure. And that works well in the micro. So in the macro, when you talk about the laws that govern your business, as well as the laws that govern the work that we do in the federal government, where is that trust defined? Is it the Privacy Act of 1975, 74? Somewhere around there. Is it a combination of a lot of different laws? And I kind of think that that's sort of something that we can hone in on.
Yeah.
Right? Where are the standards defined?
And I think that's a fantastic question because it goes into not necessarily a legal aspect of the governing entity, but what is the philosophical direction of that organization itself in concert to the content? We talked a lot about who owns the content. Is it the individual organizations? We have this conversation in private sector a lot. Our belief system is that it's very clear. You get into consumer-oriented ones, it's a little bit gray. My belief system, if I have my social security number, and of course it's being leveraged by the various agencies in the government, that's my information. I should have a right to block it, opt out, or opt in. I should have a right to know where that data is going and how it's being leveraged. But that might not necessarily be the viewpoint of various agencies, perhaps. And therein lies a distrust because there's not clarity around that.
Right. Thank you, Justin.
I've got, following up on the trust comments, which is really true. One of the words that's up there that we did discuss, and that is access. The information is out there. The big word was privacy because Chris complained there is no privacy anymore. The information is out there. But what we really don't do well enough is set some standards for who has access. We're not always told who has access in limiting the capabilities of that access. We do that with our systems. While this group of people, these roles are the only ones who have access, we need to do a better job of who has and what roles have access to whatever data. And anytime we have a data set, there should be, okay, what are the rules for access to that data set?
I completely agree. However, I'm not willing to give up on the belief system of privacy. I think we do. I think it's changed. I think it's much, much more challenging as an individual to maintain privacy of activities. But I still think that we have a right, and I still believe that we have a capability of doing it. But it's a lot more difficult with mobile devices, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, things that you're talking about.
Yeah, I just want to say, going back to the example of if the gentleman comes up and he hits you 5 times and he approaches you again, and you can assume he'll do it again on the 6th time. But one of the things around trust that our table discussed was sometimes the algorithms work against you a 5th time, a 6th time, but you may not even realize it's happening. So, for example, if you have a colleague, or friend or family member that, let's say, is terminal with cancer, and you run a lot of searches to get smart on what they're going through, now perhaps you're tagged with a health issue. So then, let's say 6 months later you're applying for medical insurance, you might get declined. So you got hit, but you don't even know why you were declined because they don't have any obligation to report it to you. Likewise, you're pricing for airline tickets or what have you. Things get skewed against you because of searches you've done or things you've posted on publicly, and you don't even realize that you shouldn't trust, and you're a victim, but you don't even conceptually understand what happened to you.
Absolutely. That was a conversation at our tables. I feel like I'm hogging a microphone now. Sorry. Where there's two things.
Justin, I just looked at the schedule. We got another hour of interaction, so if you haven't said anything yet, think of something to say.
So I've got 2 things: a hog-hollering voice and a politician kind of syndrome. So I can talk for hours. So you've got algorithms that are producing results or insights into data that we've never seen before. The ability to leverage machine learning or assisted machine learning algorithms or behavior algorithms that we're now starting to see in this context of what is big data. It's not really size of data, it's the algorithms to me. But the second one goes back to an earlier point of what is the recourse of just misinformation? If you've ever tried to correct information on a TRW, it's the most painful experience ever. But if I wanted to correct information in, say, an Ancestry.com database, is there a recourse that I have? There's no damages, so there's no motivation or even onus on Ancestry to fix it, but we should. Is that a new legislation that we should start consider and drive in if it is going to have cascading effects and detrimental impact to individuals if they now start getting impact on health insurance saying, I don't have cancer, and yet now my insurance rates are going up for some godforsaken reason just because I was searching for, I have no idea what issues are around cancer, so I'm not even going to start talking about it. But yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll take a moment and add to the conversation since we have a little bit of time. One of the things that I thought was interesting at our table that was added to was the idea that information, even when restricted, can still actually provide a lot of insight about people. Comment was 1 + 1 = 3. And when you think about what was said, it was added on to by having a database of information from the Census Bureau, a database of information from the NIH, a database of information from the EPA, and even though those 3 data points don't have an individual's name assigned to it, that 1 + 1 enables you to identify all sorts of personal information about the region, about the people, about your gender, about your biases for marriage and children, for the types of food you eat. I mean, there was all sorts of information, even if we tried to protect our own identities and the information that's personal to us that people will be able to put together no matter how protective we are of that data. The other idea I think that was interesting was at the table we kept trying to define the data set and define the problem. And I think a lot of the problems expanding at an exponential rate that we haven't even started to address yet. Things like the Internet of Things when it comes to an IP address in our home, tracking what's in our refrigerator, the type of food that we're getting, when the food is not in the refrigerator, so they lower the electricity, but then all of a sudden you know that that house is empty. And when Sears collects that data and says, well, I'm going to make a better refrigerator that has more soda cans in it, but it also has that piece of information that it's not there for 2 weeks every July, somebody either has the opportunity to pattern analysis who we are, whether or not they want to either break into the house, or if you're a government official and it comes to security, when the Secret Service may not be around, and all of a sudden you know you have to worry about movement of somebody who's got a presence to them that's important. So we saw the problem set really expanding quite a bit in the next couple of years, and it hasn't been well defined yet for the easily predictable things that are coming. Fitbit is an example. They're collecting data on the amount of steps I take every day. It's now being transmitted to my computer, going to Vitality, and giving me cheaper insurance. That type of information now is no longer private. It's in the public sphere, and it's coming right out of my house. So those types of things, I think, from the problem set are really expanding still. That was just a thought to add.
Absolutely. So if I could get a raise of hands, who in this room, and I can't remember which company does it, but who in this room would put a device on their car to get lower car insurance based on their driving habits? Who would do it? I figured you'd do it, Don. Would anybody be willing to offer that they have done it or they've put it in one of their kids' cars? Unknowingly, right?
Kids' cars. It's Allstate Progressive.
Is Allstate and Progressive that do it?
Going back to the trust issue, I think that the analogy of getting hit 5 times and trusting that you'll be hit the 6th time, I think another word can be used that you assume. I think that notification is important to in regard to knowing what you can trust in notification and what's going to happen with the information and what should not happen with the information.
One of the things I think is interesting is that there's just sort of disconnect between what the general public understands about what kind of data is being collected when, of course, you have the issue of if you know you're submitting something through Fitbit, okay, that's fine, that's one thing, but I mean, there are even services now that if you're, say, typing an email, it will track what you've typed the first time, even though you didn't even send the email. You know, you delete it, send something else. Well, that doesn't matter. They've already tracked, what you've written. And so a lot of people, don't really understand, sort of the magnitude of the data that's being collected about them. And that's just a whole second level to kind of think about.
One thing that I don't think that a lot of people realize is the extent to which their data can be shared, and what may seem to be completely different brokers of data are actually the same thing. An example that was used at our table was, let's say that you use Gmail and you have an email that talks about investing. Maybe somebody uses the term investment or investing, and they don't even necessarily use it in the context of I actually want to start, investing in a mutual fund or something like that. But you may still get ads that are posted, sidebar, banner, whatever, all over the internet for somebody like Vanguard or Fidelity or somebody, just because that term appeared once or twice. And these seemingly disparate places all get their data from all over the place. And it's really difficult to keep your online profiles separate because they're constantly trying to marry them up and create more holistic views of who you are online.
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, I think that we've all sort of experienced that first shocking moment when we spent the entire night before shopping for shampoo on Amazon, and then the next day we're reading our Washington Post article, and all of a sudden an advertisement for shampoo comes up on up in the ad box, right? And your first reaction is, how'd they know that? How'd they know that I needed shampoo? How'd the Washington Post know that? And then you have to kind of deal with that and come to that realization that that's all sort of there. That's all being recorded history in your browser. Don, are you the magic behind the word bubble here? So Don's going to give us the word bubble for the combined groups. So this includes both the east side and the west side. And I don't know if we can get the big words, Don. I don't know if we can get some of the smaller words. Sure does. Perhaps a weather vane?
A little gothic there.
Very gothic. All right, so data, privacy, information. No shock. How did privacy end up there twice? Oh, capital P, I think. Couldn't even tell.
Actually, that's a great point from a definition perspective.
Oh.
Privacy, little privacy, or big privacy, as we go through legislation and everything else. And I know that sounds funny, but think about it. Privacy is an under aspect to everything we're doing, even if it's a major issue or policy driver as we go forward. And although there are no firm definitions, and we talked a lot about context and scenarios, I think we do need to keep that in mind as we look at the implementation of NIST 853 Rev 4, as we look at new technologies that are driving this. One of the other things that I identified to our table when we were talking, how many of you have heard of Virtue, V-I-R-T-U? There was a notice on January 21st about a new company coming out for the encryption of your Gmail or your Yahoo Mail so that you don't necessarily get those shampoo advertisements, the ability to kind of shelter from the consumer level. So I think we're going to see multiple definitions of privacy, and that data is absolutely larger than the information that we receive. So in many ways, this bubble seems very true to me.
So there's one up here that's kind of popped out. I don't think we've talked about it, so please forgive me if we have. Generation. There was a lot of good discussion, I think, at all three tables that I was at that talked a little bit about generation. Anybody have any thoughts on generational differences in how they treat privacy, and what are some of our go-forward actions with respect to generation?
And speaking about generation, I know for our table we kind of hit on it. There's the perception and reality, right? So the perception that, you know, younger folks are okay with giving their privacy, but if you actually look at statistics, it's actually about equal to, you know, people who might be a little older. So why, and then we kind of talked about why is there a difference between that perception and the reality of privacy within the generations as well.
Yeah, just to talk on the issue of just privacy and generations. I actually did a blog post for GovLoop about this a while back. It's, in terms of social media, what you're seeing is a sort of movement away from a very, you know, public sort of like display of your information into like private messaging apps. So like the messaging app WhatsApp and Snapchat and those kinds of things are becoming a lot more popular because a lot of younger people are kind of starting to realize, well, you know, maybe that tweet I sent out last week and I got in a lot of trouble about it, that's probably not the best way to move forward. But there's just sort of some ironic things like WhatsApp. I mean, it's, if you read about the security in that app, it's not very good, you know, and there are some people who say, you know, it's just not a very secure app. So if you're sending things through WhatsApp and you think it's private, it's really not. So there is sort of that perception versus the reality. But I think you'll see a lot more of movement, you know, towards people using private messaging. But then once again, even with Snapchat, it's, you know, designed to be where, you know, your message shows up for 3 seconds, then it goes away, but everyone knows you can just take a screenshot and save it. So as people, you know, who are in younger generations are trying to move towards more privacy, there is still some reality that's out there.
Those are great comments. We talked about it at our table as migration, almost nomadic in the younger generation, the perception of privacy. And I used an example of my teenage daughter who went from Facebook to Tumblr to Snapchat to direct tweets, and in between they are moving from app to app for smaller and smaller trusted circles. They use it not only as an advertising/testing tool with friends and communities, but then they're moving on. In some ways, they are adapting so much faster to privacy in a different way. They don't want their information out there. They also can identify via Facebook, and I use this example as well, who the law enforcement officers are in their high school, or who are undercover trying to find out who's doing what at their particular schools. And I think it's part of the conversation that we have to understand and look at from privacy information and data.
Yeah, and then once again, it just sort of goes back to what I said about Snapchat and taking the screenshots. Even when you go back before social media, it was email. You know, people thought that was private, but how many emails have we seen that have gone viral because of the content that was in it? You know, young people need to really understand that just because you send a direct tweet to someone doesn't mean that that is the end of it. Like, it's going to be between you and that other person. So it's really, you know, it's like you have to kind of go back to anything that's on the internet has the potential to be public. And then even a step beyond that is right now, pretty much anything you do in public, someone can film it on a cell phone and it, you know, can wind up on the internet. So we're just, you know, in a very different world. And in my opinion, you know, as much as you want to protect your privacy, I think you need to more think that we're just in a different environment right now and things aren't as private as they used to be.
And I think that was one of the topics of conversation. One of the tables I heard was information sharing, right? So you kind of mentioned it that, you know, you have a direct chat or you're sharing a picture to one person, but you don't know what that other person is going to do with that photo, right? So that person shares it with two others, and then, you know, you get that domino effect and chain effect. So that one person becomes like 50 people, and then it's out in the public then.
I think this goes back to our earlier topic on education, because I don't think the younger generations are really as aware as we want to believe they are. I mean, I've gone to talk at high schools where they don't understand that things that they're posting on Facebook could have repercussions on them getting or not getting into college, and how that information is used, implications of personal safety if the wrong people get that information. And I think it's our job too to, you know, just to be personally accountable, but to make sure that this is built into their education, because, you know, we weren't learning the same way or communicating the same way as they are now.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. Totally agree with that. And I don't know if you did this on purpose, Don. He found education. It's right there, the finger's pointing to it. So it's up there. You know, I'll tell you, you know, the thing about education, and being a CISO within an organization, it's always that other thing that you know that you need to get done. And for those of us that are kind of bogged down by the compliance aspect of it, education is that security awareness training that you have to take every year, right? But I've recently really been, I think, positively impacted by some of the educational stuff that we've been doing within our agency. I'll tell you a quick story. We had tried to better inform our users of spear phishing attacks and attempts, and we would send out, you know, different communications to people. But one of the other things that we did was we set up a spam email box. We basically tell the users, if you get something that you're not sure about, send it to this mailbox, and we'll have somebody, a real person, look at it and help you sort of understand whether this is real, whether it's spam, whether it's something more nefarious. And we've been doing this for the last couple years, and we have an individual within our office whose primary job is just to respond to those emails. So we had a spear phishing or a phishing test that was run on our agency, and it hit about 1,000 people within our agency. And of those 1,000 people, about 30 people clicked on the link, and 17 actually filled in the data. So obviously there's some work that needs to be done, but out of 1,000 people, I'll take a 1% hit on that, right? But what was more, to me, what was more interesting was that we started this on Thursday morning. by Friday morning at about noontime, over 150 people had sent that communication to our spam abuse box. So we had a really good response from the agency that sort of recognized that something was amiss. And the communication, you've probably seen it before, was one of those communications that said, we set up the Outlook web access email box for you, click on the link and provide your domain username and password, and then we'll get you. So it wasn't one of the easier spear phishing tests. It was a slightly more difficult one. So I've sort of come around, looking at those numbers and then talking to my peers at USDA and asking them, what they get out of this. And actually, the person at the department that watches the activity in the spam abuse box as well, he thought that we had tipped off our agency to the test, and we hadn't. As a matter of fact, Leo and I didn't even know about it. We were sort of rushing around trying to figure out what was going on and how we should respond to the agency. So it sort of turned me around. Education is key. It's not something that is immediately measurable, and it takes time and it takes effort, but it can really improve what your response is to these situations. Yes.
Yeah, I would just add too that education is key, and right now I think one of the critical components that people need to understand is that we're moving forward from like phishing schemes and spamming schemes into really like destructive viruses that are intentionally out there just to sort of encrypt your data and hold it hostage. So it's kind of a different environment as well. It's not just, you might get a virus and it'll send out some spam messages. It can actually kind of lock down your files.
Yeah, actually, just to follow up to both of those points, and I think it's not just the young that are underinformed, it's also the old. Something that just really raised my ire about a week ago is a phishing message about a funeral arrangement. And I can totally see my mom clicking on that thing, right? And then we responded, I've got a small consulting firm too, one of these ransomware attacks. Very low dollars. Our laws don't protect against that type of a thing, but very malicious, particularly to the small business community, where a small business that gets hit by something even as simple as that, 60% of them are out of business within a year. Very frightening. So I think we got to figure out, and the government isn't going to take care of all this stuff. Either, we as small business owners or large business owners or community people or people in a church, either we're going to do something about it because we are very well informed, or we're not. So I think that's really the call to action.
Yeah, another show of hands. Who in the room has actually gotten the phone call from the Microsoft support desk that their computer was actually spitting malware out to the internet, and they needed to allow this person to log into their computer and fix it? Gotten it? My dad got it, and he lives kind of south of Charlottesville, and we go down and see him probably once every month or two. And I just happened to be sitting in the kitchen eating all his food, and I hear him talking to this guy on the phone. And, I kind of walked in. I was really kind of interested in what was going on. And here he is handing over the keys to the kingdom to this guy on the phone. And it just blew my mind. And I'm sitting there thinking about it. But, the reality is you're not always in the moment, right? You're not always thinking. It goes back to the trust discussion. Some of us, not all of us, I think those of us in security might be a little bit different, but there is this inherent trust that people are representing what they say that they're representing, and that's not necessarily the case.
I'm Ben Bergerson. There's experiential education that, combined with your annual security awareness training, is a lot more effective. So you have to take your annual security awareness training and you put in your privacy training. Then there are some organizations that have data loss prevention, DLP, that blocks your privacy information that you're sending out over the internet or via email. Where I'm at, you'll then get a phone call and an in-person visit from a security officer who will sit down and say, let's review the training that you had last month, because it appears that you may be confused about some of the pieces. So I will explain it personally, what this means, that the slide deck you took, and what you did wrong, and that sending your resume out over the internet with your social security number is not the best thing in the world. to do because it's got your home address, your name, and your social security number. And we know that you weren't doing anything that you weren't supposed to, but that is your own personal privacy that you can be aware of. And then if you're a custodian of real data, well, then it's a different discussion of how many other people's social security numbers and home addresses and credit card numbers did you spill. Even if the DLP system blocks it, you still get a visit and say, our technical controls worked, you're safe, you're not in trouble. However, we want to make sure you don't do this again because our system does not block everything. No system is perfect. And after you do those live one-on-one training sessions, the culture changes very fast because then the second meeting is, okay, this is the second time it's happened. We're going to have the training session with your supervisor as to what he needs to be doing. And it stops real fast.
So
education works.
Really quick, we're going to take a couple more questions and then we're going to have Robert close out in terms of, so if you have some really pressing things, either a really good discussion, I really hate to start breaking that up, but just for interest time, start thinking about some things, closing comments.
I think one of the issues that we face is that in a lot of cases, people don't want to admit that they aren't as good about checking up on their data or making sure that they're making good decisions when they share their data because you want to feel in control. Everybody wants to think that they're fairly savvy or at least good at using computers, interacting with their apps. And then once they are told that they're not, they don't always have the avenue for educating themselves or finding out about how they can get better at protecting their information. And sometimes I think there could even be a resistance to, well, I don't think I'm doing anything wrong. And so I'm not exactly sure what the answer would be, but trying to get people to admit that they aren't as good as they think that they might be in protecting their data could be going a long way to getting more awareness and better protection within the internet and the community.
Yeah, I think to add to the discussion, two things to tie together that were brought up already with identity management, an area of expansion will be authoritative sources that we actually approve as the individual for authoritative information that we have about ourselves, tying it to the data loss prevention. I think there's going to be a convergence, not between our skepticism with the data that the government collects, but that same skepticism we already have with the commercial sector. That convergence will lead to data loss prevention at the individual, and that we'll have DLP solutions that are no longer just in our trusted internet connections of the government and some of our agencies, but they will also now be something that we have in our houses and teach ourselves and have for our children, so that we will actually provide a technology to help protect the information for ourselves, our spouses, and our children. I think it's part of the solution that we're going to start seeing evolve.
All right, we out of words? All right. Go ahead, Robert. Or Bob.
Well, a lot of conversation going on, a lot of topics. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bob Post. I am the chair of the Cybersecurity SIG. So all of the conversation, all of the issues that are raised, all of the attempts to get answers are going to fall on the SIG to try and come up with a coherent narrative as to address this issue. And it is just amazing. I mean, I listened to Peter talk and, build it in as opposed to bolt it on later. These are the same arguments that we've been having within the cybersecurity community for years and trying to get that point across. So I think we should probably get together and share some stories on that. Getting the privacy people and the security people together in the beginning is enormously important because, as it was said, you can't have privacy without security. But to build that in, you have to know what you're trying to protect there. To have that dialogue is extremely important. And I look forward to any of the privacy officers or people who are involved in privacy in the audience who participated today to join in the SIG and help us sort through this. This is just the start of the conversation. This conversation is going to go on, and it's going to be integrated into various ACT, IAC events as we move along. and the work products that come out of the SIG. So, everybody today, thanks for being here at the start of this. Mark your calendars. This was the start of a new thing with the SIG. With that, I would like to thank our sponsors, Palo Alto, for helping us put this on today and getting us the room where we could bring everybody together. Peter for his speech in the beginning, and Justin coming all the way from the Bay Area. It's a long trip, but it's very cold. I'll swap with you sometime. Yeah. And I'd like to thank everybody for participating. And Leo and Brad, great job. Maria, you've been a driving force of putting this thing together. To thank you and Robert and all of the IAC staff. And all of the folks that helped take the notes today that went into creating these fantastic word bubbles, and we'll actually have some sort of record of this meeting that we can take back into the SIG and start working it. So with that, I think we can just wrap it up. I've learned a long time ago not to stand between people too long at lunch. So again, thank you for coming. Thanks for your active participation. A lot of good work today, as we said earlier. A lot of questions and not a lot of answers, and hopefully we'll get some of these answers as we progress through the year. Thank you.